Hey, this is Chris. Today we are going to be talking further about Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Last video we talked a little bit about the word abolish. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the word fulfill. What did Jesus mean when he said he had come to fulfill the law and the prophets? There is great importance in finding the correct definition of the word fulfill as Jesus used it. It informs our understanding of the relationship between law and grace. And it also helps us decide an important factor about Jesus' teaching, which is, does it fall more into the Old Testament / Old Covenant paradigm, or does it fit more into the New Testament, New Covenant paradigm? So we have two choices. The first choice is to fulfill means to keep. I would think that most Christians would think that this was the correct definition. Jesus kept the law. After all, he did. And we know he did because he was resurrected from the dead. And obviously, God would not resurrect someone from the dead who did not fulfill his law to the uttermost. But there is another definition that we have available to us. And that is, fulfill means to point to. In other words, the law prophetically points to Jesus. He is the fulfillment of the law. Just in his person, the law itself pointed to him and him alone. I'm not going to get into a big discussion. I'm just going to present my point of view. The second is the best, for a simple reason. This definition most closely fits the way Matthew used the word fulfill in the 15 other times it was referred to in his gospel. So let's take a look at how Matthew selected Old Testament prophecy to show that Jesus was the fulfillment of that prophecy. First, let's go to Matthew 1:22. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Matthew 2:13 through 2:15. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there till I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew 2:23. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Matthew 8:16. Excuse me while I scroll. And 17. That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. The important thing to notice is that all these Old Testament prophecies mentioned by Matthew terminate in Jesus. They find their fulfillment in him. The way you have to look at Old Testament prophecies is to try to ignore the fact that you're a Christian and try to imagine that you are a first century Jew or older. And how would you look at these prophecies if you were back then instead of now, if you didn't have the benefit of the full revelation of Jesus Christ, and you simply had your Old Testament, and you were looking at these things, it's pretty clear that you would be expecting someone to fulfill these prophecies. And of course, Jesus did come and fulfill these prophecies. I think the point is, and of course this is what we call a word study, Matthew chose to use the word fulfill, and he chose to use it one way 15 times. And so we get to Matthew 5:17, and it is entirely consistent and entirely reasonable to think that he has used the word fulfill here in exactly the same way that he has used fulfill in the other 15 instances in which he's used it previously. Therefore, we can conclude that the law has a prophetic function. In other words, it's not just the prophets who foretold of a man who would come and do all these things. The law itself declares that a man would come and do all these things. Do all these things that the law required. So the law points to him, that is Jesus, in several ways. It points to him in the obedience it requires. It points to him in the description of the priesthood. And it points to him in the description of the sacrifices. All these things say, hey, there's someone coming. That person, just by being there, just by being born, actually fulfills what the law is talking about, what the law hints at, what the law is prophetically pointed to. They all point to Jesus Christ. They all do. So I think, in my opinion, and so, that Matthew's made his point. He's made his point that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. Just, he is it. It doesn't matter what he did. Well, it matters what he did. But his arrival, his appearance, fulfilled not just the prophets, but also the law itself. The entire Old Testament points towards his coming. Before he's even done anything, it points towards him. That is the authority under which he starts his ministry. Just the fact that he is there makes him relevant. But, hey, look, I understand good people can disagree on passages, especially as one as difficult as Matthew 5:17. Fortunately, we don't have to just rely on Matthew 5:17 to come to a good conclusion to this, because all we have to do is go over to Romans 3:21 and 3:22 to see that another apostle, Paul, gives us exactly the same viewpoint as Matthew did as he wrote his gospel. Romans 3:21 and 3:22, but now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. Just taking the verse at face value, a wise thing to do in this instance, we find that Paul is really saying the same thing in Romans as Matthew, Jesus, is saying in the Gospel of Matthew. Just as the righteousness of God appeared apart from the law, it was still something that the law bore witness to. Likewise, Jesus appeared apart from the law. even as the law bore witness to him. I dare say you really can't disentangle Jesus the man from the righteousness of God. They are so closely intertwined, and this is why these verses are relevant to one another. These passages are relevant to one another because both writers, Matthew and Paul, are saying essentially the same thing, that the law pointed to something, that the prophets pointed to something, and yet the thing that they pointed to was not a part of them. It was something new. Therefore, we see that neither the righteousness of God or Jesus himself are expansions or revisions of the law and the prophets. I know I keep saying law, and the passage actually does mean the entire Old Testament. And so keep that in mind. I mean, I'm just, I'm focusing on the law, so I'm not trying to confuse anyone. I'm not trying to mislead you. I'm just, the whole thing is about Torah observant Christianity. And so, the law is the central focus, but that doesn't mean that the prophets aren't included. It does mean the whole entire Old Testament. So that therefore we see that neither the righteousness of God nor Jesus are expansions of the law or revisions of the law. They are something new. They are the dawn of a new way of God interacting with man. A new way, which obviously implies the new covenant. So I'm going to stop right there because I think we've established that Jesus fulfilling the law means that the law pointed to him and him alone, and so that whatever he taught and however he lived really did start something new. For the most part, we can go through the Gospels and we can see that it's not 100% thing. But as far as the teachings about the kingdom of heaven, if you ever see that word, certainly that refers to the new covenant, the new way of doing things, the new way that God had decided to relate to man, the new, most gracious way that God had decided to relate to man. Don't really know what's on the next video yet. Thinking about a comparison between the new covenant and the old covenant, the idea that Jesus was a lawgiver, very interesting stuff. You can't have a covenant without some rules, and that applies to the new covenant too. So give this some more prayerful thought, and we'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, God bless you.